The war was over, and across Japan, temple bells rang as people whispered the word surrender. But for a group of young women in faded naval uniforms at Yokosuka Harbor, this was not liberation. It was captivity. They were ordered into American trucks, their faces pale with dread, clutching what little they owned. What would happen to them in the hands of their sworn enemies? Humiliation, violence, or something far more unsettling? Comment below. Do you think their first days in America brought cruelty or a shocking paradox? The summer of 1945 carried an air that felt both weightless and suffocating. In Tokyo, the fires had finally gone out, leaving a blackened skeleton of a city. In the coastal base of Yokosuka, however, the silence was broken by the drone of American trucks and the heavy clatter of boots. For the women in gray-green auxiliary uniforms, this silence was worse than the sound of air raid sirens. It meant the waiting was over. Their empire had fallen, and now they themselves were trophies of defeat. Among them stood Aiko Tanaka, a 21-year-old naval nurse who had spent the last year patching up wounded sailors in makeshift clinics, as supplies dwindled to rags and morphine became a memory. Her hair was tied back with a strip of cloth that had once been white. Beneath her uniform, she kept a handkerchief embroidered with cherry blossoms, a gift from her mother before she left Yokohama. It was soft from years of use, stained by salt and sweat, yet it remained her only anchor to the life before war consumed her youth. The women shuffled forward, dragging canvas bags that sagged with meager belongings, a tin cup, a cracked comb. Sometimes nothing but an old diary or a photograph creased from too many folds. They whispered in fragments, voices thin as if afraid the American guards might hear. "They will shame us," one muttered. "They will make examples." Another clutched a rosary carved from bone. Naomi Sato, a 20-year-old who had once tapped out coded signals in a communications post near Nagoya, bent close to Aiko and whispered, "They will parade us through their streets." Aiko said nothing. The stories she had heard from officers retreating from Saipan and Guam were filled with warnings of American cruelty, of humiliation beyond words. The fear thickened around them like smoke feeding on rumor more than fact. At the edge of the harbor, the smell of salt water mixed with oil and sweat. American soldiers barked orders in clipped English, their accents strange, almost musical to ears used to harsh command. The women could not understand the words, but understood the gestures. Climb aboard. Sit down. Stay quiet. Aiko obeyed, clutching her mother's handkerchief in her palm as if it could shield her. The truck's metal floor was hot beneath her knees, the air stifling. She could hear the ocean beyond the dock, restless, endless, waiting to swallow her fate. As the convoy rumbled through Yokosuka's ruined streets, Aiko looked out at the husks of buildings. Children scavenged among rubble, their ribs visible beneath torn shirts. An old man bowed low as the trucks passed his face unreadable. The women turned their eyes away, ashamed that even in defeat they still wore uniforms that had become symbols of pain to their own people. When the truck stopped, the women were herded toward the pier, where a massive gray vessel loomed, its hull marked with the insignia of the United States. It was the USS General Harry Taylor, a troop transport now repurposed to ferry prisoners across the Pacific. The sight of its towering frame silenced the women. To them, it was not a ship, but a verdict, a steel judge that would carry them to whatever fate America had chosen. The boarding was slow, methodical. Each woman's name was copied in Roman letters onto a manifest often misspelled, their identities reduced to awkward syllables. Aiko felt her cheeks burn as the clerk stumbled over her surname. To lose control of even her name was a wound sharper than hunger. She stepped onto the gangway, her legs trembling with each creak of wood, and entered the shadow of the ship's cavernous hull. The air inside reeked of diesel and iron. Somewhere above, ropes groaned and seagulls shrieked, mocking their helplessness. They were led below deck into a hold lined with stacked bunks narrow as coffins. The heat was suffocating. The women sank onto the metal frames, too exhausted to speak. Aiko pulled the diary from her bag and scrawled a few words with a stub of pencil. "We are leaving Japan. Mother will not know where. Perhaps she will think I am already dead." She paused, her hand shaking. For a moment, she imagined herself back in Yokohama, where her mother once peeled apples and saved the skins to flavor soup. That memory seemed farther away than the American coast. Above them, the engines roared to life, a vibration that filled the steel chamber and rattled their bones. The shoreline slipped away. Through a porthole, Aiko glimpsed the temple roofs, receding, the last fragments of her homeland fading into the haze. A chill ran down her spine. The women clutched at one another, silent but united in dread. Night fell quickly over the Pacific. The hold grew darker, the air heavy with salt and fear. Somewhere in the shadows, Naomi whispered again, "The Americans will not spare us." Aiko pressed the handkerchief to her face, inhaling the faint scent of cherry blossoms long since faded, and wondered whether kindness or cruelty lay on the other side of the ocean. The voyage had only just begun, but already the weight of the unknown pressed harder than chains. What awaited them beyond the horizon? Food punishment, or something neither enemy nor ally, had prepared them for the steel belly of the USS General. Harry Taylor groaned as it plowed westward, carrying its cargo of exhausted young women into waters they had never imagined crossing. The hold smelled of oil, iron, and bodies pressed too close together. Many of the women grew pale within hours, their stomachs revolting against the relentless sway of the Pacific. Buckets filled with sour bile lined the passageways, and the sound of retching mingled with the thrum of the engines. The air was so dense with the stench of sickness that even breathing felt like punishment. Aiko gripped the edge of her bunk, fighting the churning inside her. She had wrapped her mother's cherry blossom handkerchief around her wrist as if its faded fabric could tether her to solid ground. Naomi Sato, her bunkmate, sat hunched with her knees drawn tight, whispering half-formed prayers. She looked like a child lost on a street, not a trained telegrapher who once tapped codes into the ether. The women had been warned that the Americans were cruel, but their first rations were delivered in silence and with no trace of mockery. On a tray came strange abundance white rice beef stew, thick with carrots and potatoes, and a mug of black coffee whose bitterness filled the air. The women froze. To their ears it was not food, but a test. Aiko stared at the bowl, her fingers trembling. She remembered the watery soup of radish leaves she had served sailors in Yokosuka meals, stretched thinner than paper. Real rice had been gone since 1943, her lips parted, but she could not bring herself to eat. Naomi whispered, "It is poison. They feed us this so we will die quietly." A murmur of agreement rippled through the hold. Suspicion was safer than hope, but hunger gnawed at their resolve. Finally, Aiko raised the spoon. Steam curled upward and she tasted the grain. The rice was soft, the beef rich with fat she had nearly forgotten existed. Her eyes flooded and tears rolled down her cheeks before she could stop them. Naomi looked at her in horror, then in envy, and finally lifted her own spoon. Soon the sound of hesitant eating filled the hold, punctuated by sobs that no guard could explain. Above deck, a soldier with freckles handed out small green tablets to the seasick women. He spoke in clipped words they did not understand, but his gestures were unmistakable. "Swallow this, it will help." Some refused outright, clutching the tablets like potential traps. Aiko hesitated, then placed one on her tongue. Within an hour, her stomach steadied. The paradox cut deep. The enemy was curing her nausea, not worsening it. She could not decide whether to feel grateful or terrified. On the second night, the ship rolled beneath a canopy of stars so dense it seemed the sky itself was aflame. From above came the faint echo of voices. American sailors gathered on the deck, laughing, one strumming a guitar. A tune drifted down into the hold, a swing rhythm, alien to ears accustomed to military marches. Naomi pressed her face to the steel wall, straining to listen. Without warning, one of the girls from Osaka began humming a Japanese lullaby, her voice trembling, yet sweet. For a moment, the two melodies swing and lullaby collided in the night air, weaving a strange harmony. The women fell silent, listening, caught between two worlds. Days blurred together, marked only by meals and the rolling of the sea. The ship's engines were constant, a metallic heartbeat that drowned out thought. Some women scrawled farewell notes in their diaries, convinced they would never see home again. Aiko wrote, "If this food is a trick, then I will die with the taste of rice on my tongue. If it is not, then what are we to believe?" One evening, the vessel passed through a storm. The hull shook as waves slammed against it, and the hold became a coffin of darkness and screams. Lightning lit up the portholes with bursts of ghostly white, illuminating terrified faces pressed together for comfort. Aiko clung to Naomi as the ship pitched, her heart hammering. In that chaos, she thought she heard a sailor's voice calling out, not in anger but in reassurance. It was incomprehensible, yet oddly calming, a foreign sound carried on the roar of the storm. When the skies cleared at dawn, the women lay exhausted on their bunks, too weak even for fear. As the days stretched on, a new dread crept in. They realized the Pacific was endless. Their homeland had already vanished behind them, swallowed by horizon and memory. Ahead lay a continent they had been taught to fear, a land painted in propaganda as monstrous and merciless. Aiko clutched her handkerchief, inhaling the faint ghost of cherry blossoms. She whispered to herself, "Mother, forgive me. I do not know what waits for me." The voyage had changed them already. Their bodies were nourished by food they did not trust, their sickness calmed by medicine they did not expect, their ears filled with music they could not forget. The cruelty they feared had not come, but neither had kindness in the way they knew it. Instead, they were confronted with something stranger, order, routine, and a form of care that cut deeper than hostility. When at last the cry went up that land was near, the hold erupted with nervous whispers. The women clambered to the portholes, pressing their faces to the glass. Beyond the mist, the faint outline of a great city rose untouched by fire. The Golden Gate's red arch stretched against the horizon like a doorway to another universe. The women gasped, some crossing themselves, others clutching their amulets. Aiko felt her throat tighten. After weeks adrift, America was real. Yet as the ship glided toward San Francisco Bay, the paradox only grew. They had expected wolves. Instead, they faced something colder, stranger, and perhaps far more difficult to endure. The bay glittered beneath the late afternoon sun as the USS General Harry Taylor slid toward the docks of San Francisco. The air smelled different here, briny yes, but threaded with the scent of roasted coffee drifting from unseen cafes and something almost sweet, perhaps fruit carried by the coastal wind. For the women crowded at the rails, the contrast was unbearable. They had left behind the smoldering ruins of Tokyo and Yokohama, where smoke never truly cleared. Now, before them rose a skyline intact, proud and shining, as though the war had never touched it. The Golden Gate Bridge arched across the horizon, its massive red frame like a gate to another realm. Aiko clutched the railing until her knuckles whitened, staring at the bridge that gleamed like fire in the light. Around her, some women gasped, some wept, and some simply fell silent, their throats locked by disbelief. One murmured, "This is not real," as though the bridge itself was a mirage conjured by hunger and fear. When the ship docked, American guards lined the pier. Their uniforms were pressed, their boots polished, their rifles slung casually. The women braced themselves, expecting insults, jeers, the sting of humiliation. Instead, there was only brisk order. Commands were shouted, gestures made, and lines formed. The sound of boots on wood echoed sharply, but no hand was raised against them. For many, this silence was more terrifying than violence, for it stripped away the certainty of hatred. The prisoners were marched inland, their bags searched, their names copied once again into ledgers. For Aiko, the act of hearing her name reshaped into clumsy syllables by an American clerk felt like a small death. She swallowed her shame and stepped forward. She noticed the guards' expressions, curiosity in some, indifference in others. None of the snarling she had imagined, only the relentless machinery of procedure. Then came the building with steam rising faintly from its roof. The line slowed as whispers circled among the women. Naomi grabbed Aiko's wrist. "This is it," she hissed. "This is where they shame us." Their fears spiked into panic. Some women clutched rosaries, others the last scraps of family photographs. Aiko pressed her mother's handkerchief to her lips, muttering a prayer she barely remembered. The line inched forward. One by one, women entered the tiled chamber and vanished behind the door. The muffled hiss of pipes echoed through the hall, a sound that to terrified ears resembled the promise of death. When Aiko's turn came, her legs felt weak as she crossed the threshold. She expected shouts, the sting of hands, perhaps worse. Instead, a soldier set down a wooden crate and held out an object. A bar of ivory soap, heavy, white, and smooth. Its faint floral scent filled her nose. She stared at it, unable to move. Then came a towel, thick and clean, followed by a gesture toward the showers. Water burst from the pipes, not scalding, not freezing, but warm, cascading down in steady streams. The room filled with steam that wrapped around her like fog. For the first time in months, grime and sweat ran from her skin in rivulets. Her hair, once sticky with salt, loosened beneath the spray. Around her, women wept openly, their sobs mingling with the splash of water. Some laughed wild and nervous as if they could not believe it. Aiko rubbed the bar of soap between her hands and felt the lather bloom. It smelled faintly of flowers, absurdly gentle. The sensation broke her composure. Tears spilled down her face as she leaned against the tile water and grief mixing into something she could not name. When it was over, she wrapped herself in the towel and caught her reflection in a fogged mirror. The girl who stared back looked years younger, her skin pink from the heat, her hair free of lice. She could hardly recognize the nurse who had tended to sailors in bunkers, her face gray with ash. This reflection unsettled her more than hunger ever had. That night, lying in bunks in the temporary barracks, the women whispered furiously, "Why soap? Why water? What do they want from us?" Suspicion threaded every word. One girl insisted it was humiliation disguised as kindness. Another argued it was trickery that poison lingered in the soap. Yet none could deny the warmth still clinging to their bodies, the clean scent of skin, the lightness that came from being free of filth. Aiko opened her diary and wrote with a trembling hand, "We were told we would be broken, mocked, stripped of dignity. Instead, we were given soap. I do not understand. Which is more dangerous cruelty we expect or kindness we cannot explain?" She closed the book and pressed the cherry blossom handkerchief against her face, but even its familiar scent could not overpower the ivory soap that now marked her. Outside, San Francisco's lights shimmered in the distance, alien and vibrant. Inside, the women lay restless, unable to sleep. They had crossed an ocean expecting chains and whips. What they found instead was order soap, and a strange civility that cut more deeply than hatred. The journey into captivity had only begun, yet already their world was shifting in ways they had no words for. And as morning crept over the barracks, bringing the sound of boots and distant gulls, the women braced for the next revelation that awaited them inland. The train that carried them inland rattled through a countryside that seemed impossibly green. Fields stretched unbroken to the horizon, dotted with farmhouses painted white, their porches gleaming in the sun. Children on bicycles waved from crossings, their laughter carried by the wind. For the women staring from the barred windows, the sight was unbearable. Only months earlier, they had picked their way through the rubble of Tokyo, where children dug for scraps in ash and smoke. The contrast was too sharp, as though they had been dropped into a parallel world. By the time the train halted at Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, the women's nerves were raw. Guard towers loomed above their silhouettes, stark against the sky. Rows of wooden barracks stretched neatly across the grounds, their roofs intact, their paths swept clean. The barbed wire glinted in the afternoon light, yet even this seemed different, less a cage of brutality than a fence of order. Aiko stepped down from the carriage and inhaled. The air smelled of cut grass and pine, not of bombs or fire. The dissonance made her dizzy. Processing began quickly. Names were recorded, bags searched, possessions cataloged. Aiko surrendered her diary briefly, her heart pounding, but it was returned after inspection. A red stamp, now marking the back cover. She exhaled shakily, clutching it to her chest as though rescued from death. Each woman was issued plain work clothes, sturdy shoes, and a numbered tag. The absence of jeers unsettled them more than insults would have. The first meal inside the mess hall struck like a blow. Long tables groaned under trays of food steaming beef stew, bowls of boiled potatoes, loaves of white bread, sliced thick pitchers of coffee, dark and fragrant. The women froze in the doorway. The smell alone was overwhelming, rich with grease and warmth. Aiko gripped the edge of her tray, staring at the bounty as if it might vanish. She remembered the last winter in Yokohama, when her mother had boiled weeds and scraps of dried fish to keep them alive. Here, enemy soldiers ladled generous portions as though feeding comrades. At the tables, silence reigned. Some prisoners cried quietly as they ate, others refused to touch their plates. Naomi nudged her stew suspiciously, muttering, "Too much. It is a trick." Yet when she finally tasted it, her eyes widened in shock, the grease clinging to her lips. She chewed slowly, as if ashamed to enjoy it. Around them, the scrape of cutlery became the soundtrack of captivity, louder than the guards' boots. After meals, the women were marched to orientation. Duties were assigned: kitchen help, laundry detail, farm work in nearby fields. The labor was light compared to the endless drills of wartime Japan. For the first time, Aiko felt her body ache, not from fear or hunger, but from simple exertion. In the laundry, she worked with buckets of soap and starch, scrubbing American uniforms until they shone. She studied the initials sewn into collars, names of men who had fought against her own countrymen, and felt an odd guilt mixed with relief. These were shirts, not bodies. This was work that sustained, not destroyed. The strangest corner of the camp, however, was the post exchange, or PX. Shelves brimmed with goods, chocolate bars, pencils, cigarettes, even tubes of Revlon lipstick in shades brighter than blood. The women stood frozen before the displays as though at an altar. Aiko picked up a pack of Wrigley's chewing gum, sniffing the sharp mint scent. She had never chewed gum before. Around her, whispers rose, "Can this be real?" They sell this to prisoners. The abundance felt like mockery, yet also like a window into another universe. With small slips of camp coupons earned from their labor, they could purchase these items. Some women hoarded chocolate in their bunks as if it were treasure. Others smeared lipstick onto cracked lips and laughed nervously at their own reflections. Aiko bought a single pencil and paper. That night she wrote in her diary, "They feed us more than our families at home. They offer us sweets, even paint for our lips." What does this mean? Are we prisoners or children being tempted? Letters from home arrived sporadically, censored and torn. Aiko's first message from Yokohama was brief. Her mother wrote of living in a cellar beneath a collapsed house, of boiling weeds for soup, of coughing neighbors who wasted away. "If you have anything," the letter begged, "send it." Aiko folded the paper with trembling hands, shame pressing down on her chest. Her stomach was full, her skin flushed with health, yet her mother starved. She placed the letter under her pillow that night and could not sleep. In the barracks, whispers spread. "We are fed better here than in our own homes. The enemy gives us more than the emperor ever did." The thoughts were dangerous, even treasonous, but they grew heavier with each meal, each warm shower, each glimpse of goods on PX shelves. Hatred had been easy when they expected cruelty. Dignity was far harder to endure. Aiko stared at the Revlon lipstick some of the women had passed around. She thought of her mother's cracked hands, of Tokyo's ashes, of the cherry blossoms that had once bloomed over Yokohama's streets. She touched the pencil she had bought and whispered, "What world is this where the enemy gives us color while home turns gray?" The paradox was gnawing deeper every day. And soon, when the gates opened and the women were led outside the wire for work, the strangeness of America would confront them even more directly. The first time the gates opened, the women tensed as though they were being marched to their execution. Trucks rumbled into the yard, their engines coughing black smoke, and guards barked for them to climb aboard. Aiko clutched her diary under her blouse, the cherry blossom handkerchief wrapped tight around her wrist. The vehicle jolted forward, leaving behind the familiar barracks and the hum of camp routine. For the first time since their capture, the prisoners crossed the threshold of the wire. The landscape shifted as miles slipped past. Pines gave way to dry horizons, and by the time they reached Arizona, the air was hot and sharp-heavy with dust. The sky stretched vast and merciless, an ocean of pale blue. When the trucks halted, the women stepped down into a cotton field so bright with white bolls it looked like snow had fallen across the desert. Rows stretched endlessly, the plants rustling in the breeze. The sight stunned them. This was not rubble or hunger, but plenty of crops spilling across the earth as far as their eyes could see. Work began under the watch of guards who leaned lazily on their rifles. The women were handed baskets and told to pluck cotton from its husks. At first, their hands clumsy, pricked by the sharp pods, but soon the rhythm grew natural. Sun beat down on their backs, sweat rolled into their eyes, and the cotton grew heavy in their arms. Aiko found herself breathing steadily, her body remembering labor that was not war, but simply survival. Some women even laughed quietly, startled to hear their own voices rise light in the dry air. At midday, the guards signaled them to stop. They were led into a town's church hall, its white walls cool against the heat outside. Long tables stood laden with food, thick sandwiches stacked with ham and lettuce, baskets of fresh oranges, pies steaming with cinnamon. The women froze in the doorway, their bodies rigid with suspicion. Naomi's voice trembled. "They mean to shame us. This cannot be for us." Yet an elderly American woman in a flour-dusted apron smiled gently and urged, Eat, her English soft but insistent. Aiko reached for an orange. Its skin was firm beneath her fingers, its color dazzling. She tore it open and the fragrance burst into the air, sharp and sweet. Juice dripped down her hand as she bit into the flesh. The taste was so vivid it felt like sunlight on her tongue. She had not tasted fruit since 1942. Tears filled her eyes, spilling freely as she chewed. Across the table, another prisoner whispered hoarsely, "This is paradise." But Aiko's mind filled with her mother's voice. "Save the peel for soup. The memory twisted the sweetness into sorrow. Some women ate ravenously, others picked with shame, leaving food untouched as if it might condemn them. One clutched half a sandwich in her hand, staring at it as though it were a weapon. "Why do they feed us like this?" she murmured. No one answered. The silence carried heavier weight than words. That night back in camp, the barracks buzzed with uneasy whispers. Did you see the cars in town, gleaming untouched? Children chasing hoops in the streets, shops with windows filled, not shattered. The images gnawed at them, impossible to reconcile with the world they had left behind. Japan was ashes. America untouched was overflowing. Aiko lay awake, the orange peel she had smuggled into her bunk tucked beneath her pillow. Its scent filled the air, faint but persistent. She pressed it to her face, both comfort and torment. In her diary she wrote, "They feed us as if we are their own. Yet my mother boils weeds in Yokohama. How can kindness taste so sharp?" Her pencil paused, the words trembling across the page. She closed the book, unable to bear the conflict between her full stomach and her starving homeland. The next day, when they returned to the cotton fields, the sun was merciless again. But the women bent to their work with less resistance, their baskets filling faster. Aiko noticed how the guards watched them with indifference more than malice, as though they were workers, not enemies. That realization unsettled her more than the rifles slung on shoulders. As the week wore on, the routine of labor outside the wire grew familiar. But the wound of abundance deepened. Each glimpse of American life, a boy licking ice creams, row of gleaming cars, a movie poster plastered to a brick wall, cut deeper than any chain. The empire that had demanded their loyalty had left them only ruins. The enemy offered them oranges and pie. The contradiction tore at their hearts, relentless and unforgiving. Back in the barracks, Naomi whispered into the darkness, "We were told they were monsters, but who are the monsters now? Those who bombed our homes, or those who build this world of plenty?" The question hung heavy in the night air. No one dared answer. Weeks at Camp McCoy slid into months, and the rhythm of captivity dulled the sharp edge of fear. Each morning, a bell summoned them to breakfast. Each evening, the barracks filled with the quiet hum of whispers, diary pages turning, the creak of bunks settling under tired bodies. What unsettled the women most was not cruelty, but routine, orderly, predictable, almost humane. Their bodies, long starved and worn by war, began to change. Cheeks hollowed by ration soup now softened with color. Hair once brittle from malnutrition grew glossy. Skin cleared the gray pallor of Tokyo's ash, replaced by a glow of health. Aiko noticed it first in others, then in herself. One evening at the laundry, she bent over the polished steel drum of a washing machine and caught her own reflection. The woman staring back was not the gaunt naval nurse of Yokohama, but someone fuller, younger, almost unrecognizable. She reached up to touch her cheek, half expecting her fingers to meet a mask. It was not only health, but glimpses of vanity that unsettled them. In the PX, women pooled their coupons to buy a single tube of Revlon lipstick cherries in the snow, its crimson shade shocking against their pale lips. They took turns applying it, staring at their faces as though they were strangers. Keiko Mori, the former radar operator, traced the color carefully, then laughed in disbelief. "I feel human again," she whispered, as if confessing a sin. The laughter spread nervously. Not quite joy, not quite sorrow. Aiko did not try the lipstick, but she did buy a bar of Wrigley's spearmint gum. When she placed it on her tongue, the sharp sweetness exploded like nothing she had tasted before. Tears pricked her eyes. She turned away quickly, ashamed of her own pleasure. Later, she pressed the wrapper flat into her diary as though recording evidence of a world that defied reason. Letters from home arrived intermittently, written on thin paper that carried the smell of mildew and smoke. Iko's mother wrote of queuing for hours only to receive half a loaf of barley bread, of neighbors collapsing in the street from hunger. "If you have anything, send it," the letter begged. Aiko folded it with trembling hands, knowing she had nothing to give. That night, the stew sat heavy in her stomach, transformed into guilt that burned worse than hunger ever had. She wrote, "I eat while my family starves. Each kindness here is a chain heavier than iron." The guards, too, were not what the women had imagined. Most were indifferent, performing their duties with mechanical efficiency, but occasionally a moment cracked the facade. One evening at roll call, a young military policeman dropped his angle-head flashlight. Instinctively, Aiko bent to pick it up and handed it back. Their fingers brushed briefly, and he gave a small nod. Nothing more. Yet the gesture lingered with her for days, haunting her more than threats ever could. Another afternoon, while she scrubbed uniforms in the laundry, a soldier passed by humming a tune. The melody was unmistakably American swing. A girl from Osaka recognized the rhythm and almost without thinking began humming a Japanese lullaby beneath it. For a fleeting second, the two melodies wove together a fragile harmony between enemies. The moment passed quickly, but it left behind an ache that no words could ease. Not all guards were neutral. Some glared with open resentment, their eyes sharp with memories of brothers killed in the Pacific. Yet even their hostility rarely spilled into action. The absence of cruelty more than its presence destabilized the women. It denied them the certainty of hatred. At night, whispers returned. Some women admitted they hoarded bread crusts under their pillows, convinced abundance was a trick. Others confessed they could not sleep, their bodies restless from eating too well. Aiko wrote, "To be starved would be simple. To be treated with dignity by those we were told were beasts, it tears at the soul. Hatred is easy. Kindness is unbearable." Her words echoed the invisible battle raging in many hearts. They had prepared for humiliation, braced themselves for violence, and instead found themselves restored. The mirror of captivity showed them not who they had been, but who they might become, and that reflection terrified them most. As autumn crept over Wisconsin, golden leaves drifted across the camp yard. The air smelled of wood smoke, not ashes. Each day their bodies grew stronger, but their loyalties weakened. For every bar of soap, every orange, every glimpse of American normalcy beyond the wire, the fortress of propaganda they had carried across the Pacific cracked a little more. And soon, when the trucks carried them deeper into American towns, the fractures would split wider. There, among shops overflowing with goods and children laughing in streets untouched by bombs, the truth of defeat would no longer be abstract. It would stand before them undeniable and cruel in its abundance. By the winter of 1946, frost silvered the fences of Camp McCoy and thin sheets of ice formed along the barracks windows. The women huddled under blankets at night, listening to the distant crack of boots on frozen ground. The days had become routine breakfast bell labor in the fields or laundry supper under the smell of coffee and stew. Yet beneath that rhythm grew a whisper far sharper than hunger or cold rumors of repatriation. Word spread that transports were being organized, ships prepared to carry prisoners back across the Pacific. At first, the women greeted the news with stunned silence, then with unease. For months, they had whispered their fears of captivity. Now faced with the possibility of freedom, many found themselves more afraid than before. In the barracks, Naomi clutched her blanket and whispered, "If we return, what waits for us ruins hunger." Her voice trembled with something close to panic. Others nodded, their faces pale in the dim light. The thought of stepping once more into Tokyo's rubble, of seeing families gaunt with starvation, filled them with dread. Aiko opened her diary and wrote by candlelight, "I fear leaving more than I feared arriving. To go back means to face the ashes of Yokohama. Here I eat, I sleep, I live. How can I wish to return?" She stopped staring at the words, chilled by her own confession. To long for captivity was treason against her homeland, yet it was the truth. Her heart whispered in the dark. The contradiction grew heavier with each passing day. Their bodies had healed in America, flesh restored to cheeks, hair shining, laughter, sometimes returning in stolen moments. But what would their mothers say when they saw them, healthy, plump, their skin glowing, while families starved in cellars? Some women confessed their shame aloud. "My mother will not forgive me," one murmured. "She will see the food in my body and curse me." The silence that followed was thicker than any wall. Outside the camp, work details continued. In San Antonio, the women swept municipal parks and picked cotton under the vast sky. They watched American children play hopscotch, men reading newspapers on intact porches, women in bright dresses shopping at markets overflowing with goods. Each sight cut deeper than chains. The empire that had demanded their loyalty had given them hunger. The enemy gave them oranges, lipstick, even wages and camp coupons. The inversion was unbearable. One afternoon, after hours in the cotton fields, the women were led into a town church for lunch. The tables groaned under platters of sandwiches, bowls of fruit pies dusted with sugar. An elderly woman urged them kindly, "Eat, eat." Aiko bit into a slice of apple pie, the sweetness almost painful. She whispered to herself, "Paradise tastes like betrayal." Back in camp, whispers turned darker. Some spoke of refusing repatriation, others of hiding when their names were called. But everyone knew there was no choice. The Americans would decide, and they would obey. Letters from home sharpened their dread. Aiko's mother wrote again. "We live now in the cellar. The house above is gone. We boil weeds for supper. Your brother coughs each night. If you have anything, send it." Aiko pressed the letter to her lips and wept silently, tasting salt more bitter than the stew she had eaten hours earlier. Her belly was full, but her soul starved. Even the guards sensed the shift. One soldier muttered to another, "They look better fed than folks back home." His tone was half resentment, half wonder. Yet the Geneva Convention left no room for change. The women remained well-fed, clothed, and housed while their homeland withered. At night, Aiko lay awake staring at the rafters, her diary hidden beneath her pillow. She whispered the words she could not write. "I'm afraid to go back." Around her, the barracks creaked with restless bodies, each prisoner lost in her own silent battle. The war had ended, but for these women, a harsher conflict had only begun. It was no longer about guns or bombs, but about memory and identity. They were prisoners, yes, but they were also nourished, even restored. The thought of returning to starvation and ruins felt like a sentence worse than captivity. And so when the announcement finally came that a transport was imminent, the camp erupted in fearful murmurs. Trucks would carry them to the coast, ships would bear them across the ocean, and Japan would greet them, not with relief but with ashes. For Aiko and the others, the question was no longer whether they would survive, but how they could live with what survival meant. Frost clung to the wire fences of Camp McCoy, glittering faintly in the pale light of morning. The ground crunched beneath boots as guards assembled the women in tight ranks, their breath rising in clouds against the freezing air. Silence hung heavy, broken only by the distant caw of a crow. Every prisoner knew what was coming. The rumors had congealed into truth. Today, names would be read, and those names meant departure. Aiko Tanaka stood in line, her fingers gripping the cherry blossom handkerchief hidden in her sleeve. She could feel Naomi trembling beside her, her lips pressed tight in prayer. Keiko stared straight ahead, jaw set as though facing a firing squad. None spoke. Words had become dangerous, brittle as ice. An officer stepped forward, a clipboard in his gloved hand. His voice cut through the cold with a steady rhythm. Each name echoed like a blow against stone. Women flinched as their identities were summoned into sound, the syllables bent by foreign pronunciation, yet sharp enough to pierce. One by one, they stepped forward, their boots crunching across frost. When Tanaka Aiko was called, the world seemed to still. Aiko's heart pounded so violently she feared others might hear it. She stepped forward, the ground unsteady beneath her feet. The officer marked her name with a stroke of ink, just ink, but it felt like a verdict. She moved into the assembly yard where a line of trucks waited, their engines idling with a low growl. The women gathered there stared at the vehicles as though they were coffins. Some wept silently, clutching their belongings. Small bags filled with soap pencils, wrappers of chewing gum kept as talismans. Others stood rigid, their faces blank masks carved by resignation. The smell of diesel filled the air, bitter and final. Aiko pressed her handkerchief to her lips. She thought of Yokohama, of her mother's cracked hands and her brother's hollow cough. She thought of Tokyo's streets reduced to rubble where children picked weeds for soup. And then she thought of the PX shelves lined with lipstick, the sweet taste of oranges in a church hall, the warmth of ivory soap against her skin. Between those two worlds stretched an abyss she could not bridge. Her diary lay tucked against her chest. Inside its pages were the confessions she could never speak aloud, that captivity had fed her more than freedom ever had, that kindness from the enemy cut deeper than cruelty, that she feared going home more than she had feared capture. She longed to tear the pages out, to scatter them in the frost, yet her hands would not move. The diary was her truth, unbearable, but hers alone. The line shuffled forward, boots crunching, voices low. Trucks swallowed groups of women, their engines coughing smoke into the pale sky. The sound of the doors slamming shut rang like iron bars falling into place. Each slam was a heartbeat, each rumble a reminder that the journey was irreversible. Naomi's name was called, and she stumbled forward, nearly dropping her bag. Aiko reached to steady her, their hands clasping for a brief moment, fingers gripping with silent desperation. Then Naomi was gone, swallowed by the truck. When Aiko's turn came, she climbed the wooden steps, her body heavy as stone. Inside, the benches were crowded with women clutching their bags and staring straight ahead, eyes wide with dread. The door slammed behind her. Darkness pressed close, pierced only by a thin strip of light. The The truck jolted forward, its wheels grinding against gravel. Outside, frost sparkled on the barbed wire gilded by the weak dawn. Inside, silence hung over the prisoners like a shroud. Aiko rested her head against the cold wall and closed her eyes. She tried to imagine Yokohama, but the image blurred. Instead, she saw the orange peel beneath her pillow, the lipstick smeared across Keiko's lips, the bar of ivory soap slipping from her hands in the shower. Symbols of a world she had been told was monstrous, yet which had given her back her body, her strength, even fragments of her youth. She whispered to herself, "What is freedom? If to be free is to starve, what is captivity, if in chains we are restored?" The truck roared onward toward the waiting ships. The women did not know what awaited them across the ocean ruins, hunger, judgment, perhaps even death. But one truth had already settled among them. Like the frost on the wire, the war had ended, yet the real battle was within a battle between loyalty and survival. Hatred and gratitude, memory and reality. Aiko gripped her diary, her pulse steady now. The ink inside spoke what her lips could not. The enemy's greatest weapon had not been bombs or rifles, it had been soap bread and dignity. And those simple things had broken her more completely than war ever could. As the horizon opened before the convoy, dawn spread its pale light across the fields. The question lingered unspoken in every mind: if kindness could wound so deeply, what would happen to them when they returned to the ruins of home?